Today we're talking about two different games that on the surface seem to be pretty similar to one another. First one you probably heard of, and the second one you probably haven't heard of, but you might be glad that you did. City Skylines is a city building game, probably the best known city building game of recent years. And then we have Songs of Six, which is a brand new indie game. It's not even at 1.0 yet, and it's exceptional. The central question we're going to be exploring here is, in some sense, what I'm always exploring on this channel, which is why some games succeed at entering our minds and becoming part of who we are, while other games just don't. And some of those reasons are just personal preference, right? But what kinds of preferences are we making? What kinds of experiences do we enjoy? Most interesting to me recently has been, how does the actual business model of the game affect how we enjoy it? Because you might initially think it's just all about gameplay, but of course it's not. Everything surrounding the gameplay matters, from communities surrounding the game to the price to the perception of how the development team is operating. Basically, everything that affects how a game sits in the world affects how we interact with that game. Like I mentioned at the beginning, these two games have a lot in common. They're both top-down city building games where you play as a kind of invisible, all-powerful being that society obeys, and you get to build a little community of people that live and work together. You give these people houses, you give these people jobs, you give them roads to travel from their houses to their jobs. Both games involve managing needs and satisfaction for your little tiny society, and both games rely heavily on the simulation of thousands of tiny little characters going about their lives and interacting with each other. And this provides this feeling of scale and meaning to what you're doing as the player. So that's how these two games are similar. But the rest of this video is going to be about how they are different, and they are completely different. One is massively popular. It has publisher backing. It's a franchise. There's City Skylines 2. And the other game is relatively little known and made by a single person and has no publishing backing. It's just self-published. And there's a community built around this game that's helping with development, helping with translations, helping with features, and just it's a crowd-funded, crowd-sourced kind of experience. One of these games has a massively unsuccessful sequel, and the other one isn't even at its 1.0 build. So if we were to try to summarize all this, I feel like we have one game that's full of hope and potential, and another game whose best days are probably behind it. And I think ultimately these two games reveal something to us about how the business model and design ethos of games is evolving towards something really interesting and new. So to explain this, let's start by talking through some of the design differences inside these games. The first thing that comes to mind is scale. So City Skylines takes a modern city and lets you build that. And obviously the scale of a modern city is going to be much larger than Songs of Six's medieval style setting, right? You've got giant buildings, you've got big roads, you've got this zoomed out view of an entire landscape. In City Skylines, you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people living in your city, or at least that's the kind of city that we're representing. Whereas in Songs of Six, you have, thousands or tens of thousands at most. What's the largest city that someone's made on Songs of Six? Okay, 2 years ago, someone on Reddit made a 6,000 pop city. So that's pretty gigantic. On City Skylines, 2 years ago, largest console city, 300,000 people. This is just from a quick search, but we're talking about two different scales here, right? We're talking about, on one hand, we have the modern scale of cities, which is obviously much larger. And on the other hand, we have this kind of ancient/medieval, I think it's more accurate to say ancient scale of cities. But on the topic of scale is not just top down. It's not just number of people and number of buildings. It's also the scale at the lower scales, right? The depth. And Songs of Six on this regard is much, much more detailed in terms of the depth of the scale at the lower level. What does that mean? It means that Songs of Six is simulating individual goods. It's mapping every action of every person in the city, from using the bathroom to going to bed to recreating other members of society to even going to work. The way that a citizen goes to work in Songs of Six is that they actually walk there and they actually do the work on real goods, and they create a good with a certain amount of effort. And then that good is physically in that building, right? City Skylines doesn't do this. City Skylines is just person goes from home to work, and then they sit there for however many hours, and then they drive back. What's interesting about Songs of Six in this regard is that the UI and the role of UI is fundamentally different from something like City Skylines. So in City Skylines, everything is in aggregate. Everything is like an abstraction of what's happening, right? Whereas in Songs of Six, the UI actually has to calculate everything that's happening based on a ton of tiny little simulated interactions. It's hard to kind of like explain what this means if it's not intuitive, but in a sense, like UI can kind of tell you two different things. It can either tell you what's happening in terms of measuring things that are happening in the world, or it can tell you directly from the source of information what the simulation is planning to do, and then the rest of the game like does what the UI says. Does that make sense? So like for example, if you had like a production rate of how many carrots you're making per month, okay? The UI could tell you what the game thinks you should be making, right? So like if the game says it's 10 units per month, then the UI could show 10 units per month. But in Songs of Six, the game doesn't say it's 10 units per month. In Songs of Six, the individual people who individually go make carrots. And then however many carrots are made gets measured and then reported back to the UI. Does that make more sense? I think that makes more sense. So that was scale. And I think it kind of leads naturally into this next point, which is about control and like intentionality. So in Songs of Six, you physically put every single thing down. Okay. The map is like a tile based system where you can place like not just individual buildings, but you put the individual walls of those buildings and individual furniture in the buildings. So when you build a warehouse to store items, you put the crates down one by one. I mean, not literally one by one, but you do put them down and you arrange them inside of the building. That means that some buildings could be like inefficiently made, or like you wasted space, and other buildings could be like really well designed. And like after you settle on a design for each given building, you can just copy and paste it somewhere else. But those designs are still your designs. Like you physically put down each of those elements of furniture. So when you look at your city and it's grown so much, you know that every single thing in that was an action made by you. You know, you did that. Every single thing. And this is a big difference from City Skylines. So City Skylines, you don't put down every individual building. You don't put furniture inside those buildings. Definitely not. What you do is you mainly control what's built through zoning. So you put down individual roads. That's one place where you have a lot of control. That's probably the most interesting part of the game, for me at least, is like designing roads. And that makes sense because like modern cities are all about roads, right? Like roads control everything about how modern cities work because we have cars and we have other vehicles that require like really specialized roads. So that's not a problem. But when it comes to zoning, you're just broad strokes zoning different areas, and then you watch buildings just pop up. Just wanted to add to this that if we asked which one is a more successful simulation, probably Songs of Six. But if it's which one is a more fun game to play, now that's completely up to you. I prefer a more simulation heavy game, but I'm sure most people would rather watch something really amazing happen where like cities are kind of building themselves and you get to have some control, but not too much control. So it's not overwhelming. That's totally fine. That's normal. I'm just talking about what preferences I might have, right? So in Songs of Six, you're more of like a micromanaging king, whereas in City Skylines, you're more of like a local government. You know, you're zoning these areas, and then based on the taxes, that the tax rate and the demand, things just build themselves, and you can assume that that's like private investment or something. From a gameplay perspective, though, not having the ability to like individually place down these generic buildings, like even just houses and stuff, kind of makes the overall city feel less uniquely yours. A lot of mods for City Skylines just add in content that you can individually place down, and I don't think that's surprising at all. You know, if you want to create a city that's like unique to you and you chose everything that goes into it, you're going to have to install these kinds of mods to like nitpick and select every individual building that you're going to place. And like maybe that's not what you're interested in. Clearly that wasn't the design vision for the game, and that's not a problem. Just to be clear, this is definitely what they were going for. They were going for like a more leaning back sort of experience where you just watch your city build up. But for me, the feeling of like minute understanding of everything that's happening in my settlement, even as it like keeps scaling up more and more in Songs of Six, to me, that's just like a more satisfying narrative progression, if that makes sense. These differences in level of detail when it comes to intentional choices really change the compounding outcome when it comes to like overall decision making options and like overall variety of gameplay. When I play City Skylines, it kind of almost always feels like the same sort of game. Whereas when you play Songs of Six, it's not going to feel like the same sort of game. Both games rely on the map that you're playing on to provide variety for your playthrough because you need to like plan out resources that are on the map and like how you're going to use those, but also because you need to build around various geographic obstacles like mountains or rivers or lakes. But in the end, it just feels like Songs of Six is more successful at creating a situation that gives me variety, gives me strategic choice, and provides like a more narratively compelling experience overall. The final and most interesting point that I want to touch on is the business model differences. And this is something I've been thinking about for the last couple months. Like, how are the business models that fund games changing? So, Cities Skylines is like a traditional publisher based model where the publisher funds the developer, and then the consumers buy the game that the developer creates and the publisher publishes. This means that the funder is ultimately the publisher, and they're funding a product which is then purchased by consumers, right? So, you have a clear chain of money. Songs of Six is crowdfunded. So the funders are the same as the consumers. This is the indie model, basically, right? One guy made Songs of Six, and eventually he decided to start a Kickstarter and collect money off of that. Now the game's been out on Steam for a couple years and he's getting money from that. And that money is funding the development of the game. So the publisher, at least in terms of the publisher's role as like a source of funding, has moved that role to the consumers. And this is why you end up with games in the indie space that are more responsive to the needs of players, because players are the ones funding it. In the traditional model, if a publisher is funding a game, they get the final say on design decisions because they're paying for this product to exist. Whereas if consumers are paying for the development of the game, consumers get the final say on design decisions. Ultimately, at least in terms of like voting with their wallet or, choosing or not choosing to fund projects. And that shift into like a more democratized funding model for video games is so interesting because I don't know any media that do this. If you think about like movies or you think about books, these are spaces where the publishing model is still the norm, right? Obviously, there are indie films and there are indie books, but it's not the same because these products that are indie funded are usually just self-published. They're not really crowdsourced in the same way that a game is. They're not relying on consumers both for like funding before the project starts or at least before the project is finished. And they're not typically relying on consumer input for like the direction of the design decisions. Whereas in video games, that's very normal. You ask players what they like. You ask players what they don't like. You ask them what features you want to add. And that's so interesting. It's like, I think it's because games are an inherently more interactive medium where like the author and the audience are much more intertwined than other media because it's an interactive experience. When you're playing a game, you're a co-author on your experience of that game, right? And I think that level of additional power that you have as an audience member has actually translated upward into the business model where like now, you're also the funder of some of these projects. You're also like an investor. And that's really interesting. I'm not here to say if it's good or bad, but it's definitely interesting. Also, I just realized there's another media which is primarily crowdfunded and people give input on like design choices. It's YouTube. YouTube is crowdfunded. Obviously, YouTube itself is not crowdfunded, but I'm talking about YouTubers. Like when I create a video, that informs my design decisions for the next video, right? Like directly, there's that immediate feedback. And on top of that, the viewing of those videos and like contributions through something like Patreon or YouTube memberships, that directly funds the projects that we make. Whereas like, what's the traditional version of this? I guess it would be like sponsors. In a sponsor-based business model, the publisher is kind of like the sponsor, where it's this corporate interest that is extracting value out of the media, right? So like a publisher is extracting money out of the game directly, just through sales. But a sponsor of a YouTube video is extracting clicks or like extracting engagement or impressions out of the YouTube video. So when these big corporate funders fund media, right, they're acting more like publishers. Let's say a corporate sponsor gives me a sponsorship for a video. Don't you think that their opinions on that video are probably going to influence what I make? I mean, it's just part of the process. Obviously, in YouTube specifically, there's a culture around not letting it influence as much, but that's not always the case. You can see it all over the platform, right? So it's interesting. We're in this weird situation where democratized platforms like YouTube are becoming less democratized and more corporate, whereas like super corporate, super publisher funded spaces like video games are maybe becoming more democratized. And ultimately, I don't really think that there's like any moral dimension to this shift either way. I think it's just that in the video game space, indie projects are more responsive to community and like community needs and like consumer demand, right? They're just more responsive to it because maybe they have a more streamlined vision or they're more reliant on like social networks to get going. So maybe we have like some kind of survivorship bias. And also, a big part of this is like the cost of making games has been going down over time, right? So as the cost of games comes down, the need for publishers becomes lesser because you don't need that funding anymore. You can just fund it yourself from your second job or, save some money and try to fund something and try to survive. Whereas on YouTube, the cost of making a YouTube video has actually probably only ever gone up. People are demanding higher and higher production value. And so the need for that additional capital has actually gone up. It'd be interesting to see if AI and the whole slop and, AI leveraged tools are going to bring the cost of YouTube videos back down so that, more and more audiences are interested in like low production or at least like low production cost videos. But so far, it looks like the opposite is happening, right? Like the costs are going up. Private equity is buying YouTube channels left and right. I keep seeing videos about this. And like, it's not that uncommon for large YouTube channels to get investors, or to get like, to rely entirely on sponsors. That's just part of the system now. So it's a weird time. I don't really know how this video became about YouTube instead of being about city builders, but I think it's interesting, right? Like these are interesting trends. I think they affect all of us. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about it a little bit.